Well, good afternoon. This is Josh Hunsinger with the Placer County Agriculture Department. Welcome to the second of our Commissioner, Deputy, and Sealer oral exam preparation sessions. I thank everyone who's in attendance here today. This is, as I mentioned, the second in our series. The next one is planned for September 25th, which will be focused on agricultural funding, specifically mill tax and gas tax. So I think that's a really important topic. The PowerPoint that you will see today will be available. I think you can save it off of this webinar directly. If you have any difficulties with that, give me an email and I will email it right back to you. I'm happy to do that. Happy to hear from you and send you the PowerPoint via email. This presentation should be about half an hour, 45 minutes long, and followed by a Q&A session, which will be by written question. You can type at any time written questions, and then we'll save all the questions for the end, and I'll read them off, and then our panelists will attempt to answer them as we go. So anyways, I look forward to that. With me today, I have Kristen Macy, who is the director of the California Division of Measurement Standards within California Department of Food and Ag. And I'm planning also to have John Young, who is the Yolo County Agricultural Commissioner and Sealer of Weights and Measures. We're going to start off with Kristen Macy, and I've asked her to give a brief overview of DMS and how it relates to CDFA and to the counties and also to the broader West regional and national organizations.
I saved. Come on, show you what I did.
Okay, so you saved instead of open. Okay. You're going to have to do that all the time.
I'm sorry, somebody's.
For time being, yes. Okay. Can I close this?
Oh yeah. You can tell they're talking. They're already moving the cursor around.
Oops.
Josh, is everybody muted?
It's showing that they are. I'm not sure what we're getting coming through there.
That's not Angela, is it?
I'm not sure if it is or not. Anyways, Kristen, sorry for that, folks. Kristen, would you please give us your thoughts?
When I click on this, instead of run,
I think I know the source of the problem. Hang on just a second.
Sure.
Because for some reason, it's not saving it in the temporary file and running it.
All right, and that's probably what we ran into her.
All right, thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Kristen Macy. I'm the Division Director for Measurement Standards within CDFA. Our division is a small but mighty division within the Department of Food and Agriculture, and we work very closely with the county Sealers of Weights and Measures and their inspectors.
Today was a coffee day.
There are 1.4 million commercial weighing and measuring devices in California, and as such, it's a big task to test and inspect all those devices on an annual basis, or whatever the frequency is. And we couldn't do it without you. So we truly believe that we have a partnership with the counties, and we respect your opinion, your guidance. You're our boots on the ground. You're our eyes and our ears. And you're able to oftentimes find things that we do. You present problems to us, and then we generally work together to try to solve those. Now, of course, California is an influential part of the national scene in the United States, and California is very influential, and it has a very loud voice, actually, at the National Conference on Weights and Measures. So we have great respect when we go to the regional and national conferences. And what we say often carries a lot of weight. And I just want to compliment all of you before we get started on this presentation, which is talking about laws and regulations and the model national codes and standards and then how they develop, because you're really a big part of this. And a lot of your membership in CACASA is already, it has a long history of being leaders at the regional and national conferences. Kurt Florin is probably the most notable example of recent, but I know that Marco Maras and a lot of the deputy sealers and assistant sealers have been exposed and volunteered for key positions on committees and doing other projects for the regional and national associations. So I just want to give you all a pat on the back and say keep it up. There's a lot of talent in California, and it's coming up from your ranks. So have we got John on the line yet?
You know, we're having a technical difficulty connecting with you, Kristen, but I'm working on it.
After the thing was installed, I opened it up. That's why I think
They can hear us.
Yeah. Okay, I have cleared it.
Yeah, whoever's talking in the background, I wish would mute whatever they're doing.
I totally agree. Thank you.
I'm not sure what the issue with John is.
Clear all temporary files. I hope you don't.
Go ahead and
Going for a few minutes.
Okay.
Like,
John
Sure.
should be
No, don't
John
do
should
it
be
now.
unmuted.
I won't do it now.
John, are you there?
All right, can you hear me now?
Later on when she's not around or something.
Yeah, somebody is still speaking there. If you can hear this, please stop speaking. You're coming through to everybody.
For some
right out of
reason,
it.
it's not.
Open up the blue flower underneath there.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
All right, Josh, you ready for me to go ahead?
Yeah, I'm sorry, John.
That's all right. I'm not sure what's going on with the audio there. Okay, I'm John Young. I'm the Yolo County Ag Commissioner. I'm also the Vice President of Weights and Measures. You know, welcome everybody. Glad to see you could attend. What we're going to cover today is really from concept to completion, and how does a Weights and Measures official change the rules? So that's what we're going to talk about. What I want you to accomplish and what I want you to think about is, if it's a California-specific law, what's the process? If it's a California regulation, what's the process? And where do we fit in the national process, and how does that work for Weights and Measures officials in California? Go ahead and change the slide, Josh. So it's important for us to kind of have some foundational background on what does a county sealer of Weights and Measures do? Well, it's primarily 5 functional areas. It's commercial devices, it's quantity control, it's petroleum products, and I'm not going to read all this stuff to you. This is something for you guys to go back and you to review to make sure you have an understanding of the county sealer. Go ahead and go to the next slide. And the last 2 programs are Weighmaster and Service Agents. This is an example of the brochure that CACASA puts together to help all the sealers explain to the general public what we do. So we use this quite often when we go out into the public and talk to community organizations so they understand what we do. So I encourage all of you to use this document and be very familiar with what we do. Go ahead and go to the next slide. The next piece that's important for everybody to understand is the structure of the California Agricultural Commissioners and Sealers Association. So we have an executive team. That executive team is the president, the vice president of agriculture, vice president of weights and measures, the president-elect, executive secretary, the executive director, and the past president. And for weights and measures, it's primarily 2 committees that are of importance. It's the Laws and Regulations Committee and the Specifications and Tolerance Committees. And these 2 committees mirror what you would see at the Western and at the national level. They have chairs and they have 2 representatives from each area group. We also have a legislative committee, and what that legislative committee does is any law that needs to be changed would go through the legislative committee. CACASA operates as a board of directors that we meet twice a year, our spring and fall conference primarily, and it's important to note that everything that is done by CACASA is through the board of directors. So each committee makes a recommendation to the board of directors for action. Now within the state there's also 5 area groups that meet monthly to work on problems of mutual concern and to conduct CACASA business. And the 5 area groups are the coast, the southern, the San Joaquin Valley, the Sac Valley, and the Northern Group. And each one of these area groups also has deputies groups that meet on a monthly basis. So that's kind of the basics of the structure of CACASA. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So how, as a weights and measures official, do you go from your idea, your concept that you have, to a law or regulation? Well, obviously it starts with an idea. And that idea is really developed in-house at your county when it first starts. You start working with other inspectors, your deputy, your supervisor, your sealer, and you try to work up that idea to have an understanding of what the problem is, what is the background, and what needs to be changed or added to address that problem. Once you've developed the concept in-house, then that concept is moved to the deputy sealer's area group. And it's typically through your county's deputy sealer that item moves forward. So once it gets to the deputies group, what happens then is the deputies group continues to develop that item. They work out a problem statement, there's a backroom statement, and a solution with specific language. And what I mean by specific language is what the sealers like to see is a red line version of the law or regulation. In other words, there's strikeouts through words that don't need to be there, and when you add words to the regulation or the law, it's an underlined version. So it's very clear what the law or regulation was before and after the change. So then when the deputy sealers group is ready, the item is referred to the area sealers group. The sealers group then either further refines the process, or if there's more questions, it may end up back with the deputies group. But ultimately, it would end up on the CACASA laws or regulation, L&R committee, laws and regulations or specifications, and tolerances committee agenda. Now, there's usually 3 tracks it can take if everything goes forward and there's agreement. If it's a California-specific law change, that item is referred to the CACASA Legislative Committee for further action. If it's a California-specific regulation change, then the S&T, L&R, Vice President of Weights and Measures, and or any other interested sealer would work with the Division of Measurement Standards to develop that item. There's a very specific process for California regulation changes, and it always goes through the state entity that's authorized by the legislature to make regulation. Now, if it's a national item, those are submitted to the National Conference for consideration using what's called Publication 15. Well, you might ask, well, why are we involved in national items? Well, that's because California adopts the national handbooks by reference, which means once we adopt them, that we use them as part of our regulatory process. They become the rules. So go to the next slide, Josh.
Hey, John,
so
this is Kristen. John, excuse me.
Jump in, Kristen, go ahead.
Josh, please go back to the previous slide. There is one typo that needs to be fixed. There is a publication 15, but the change form is called a Form 15.
Form 15.
Put down there. Yeah.
Perfect. Thanks, Kristen. So the next slide is an example of what you would see coming from the deputy sealers to the sealers. And this is an example from the Sacramento Valley. Each area group has their own form. So it comes from the chair of the Sac Valley Deputies Association to the chair of the Sac Valley Ag Commissioners and Sealers Association. It has the date, it has the recommendation, it has all the background information. It has that kind of red line version of the law regulation, the date that's referred to the sealers, then the sealers put down their discussion and their recommendation of what happens to the item next, and it has a vote that goes with that as well. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Josh. So here's an example of really what happens for a California-specific law. So it's referred to the CACASA Legislation Committee. The committee then finds a sponsor to sponsor a bill. That bill's introduced. It goes to committee hearings. There's floor action. If it passes out of one house, it goes to the next. So then you have committee hearings and floor action once again. If there's amendments, it goes back to the original house. Then there has to be concurrence. At that point, it would go to the governor. If there's no amendments, it goes straight to the governor. So if the governor does not veto the item, that law change would become effective the next January 1st. So that following year, January 1st. So that's kind of how a California law moves forward. Go ahead, Josh. So now here's the rulemaking process. Very much a distinction, because the rulemaking process, first of all, you have to have a law that authorizes the regulation, and then the legislature has to grant the authority to adopt regulation to the state agency. In this case, for us, it's the California Department of Agriculture and the Division of Measurement Standards. So at that point, when there's regulatory action going to be taken, there's preliminary activities. So there's special considerations, fiscal impact. It's packaged with the text of the regulation, the statement of reasons, and the notice of proposed rulemaking. So that opens the rulemaking record. Then there's the publishing and the issuing of notice. There's a 45-day comment period. The public hearing can be put into that process by the agency or requested by anybody that wants a public hearing, and there's a certain time frame that's involved. So then the agency must consider all of the comments during that 45-day comment period. So if there are major changes that are made, it has to go out to another 45-day comment period, and it starts the process again. If there are substantial but sufficiently related changes, it's an additional 15-day comment period. Then if there's non-substantial or no changes, then it goes to the final statement of reasons, summary of response to the comments, changes to accommodate or reasons for rejecting those comments. Then they close the rulemaking record and the agency adopts the regulation. They become effective by statute, whatever date's in the statute, or quarterly. So one or the other happens there. So that's the basics of the rulemaking process. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Josh. So why do we care about the national handbooks? Well, the Business and Professions Code adopts the national handbooks. It references where we adopt them. Business and Professions 12107 is for Handbook 44, 12211, Handbook 133, and 12609 is Handbook 30. So we have the laws that reference the handbooks, and we adopt those handbooks. So that's why the national handbooks become very, very important to us. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Josh. So NIST Handbook 44 is the specifications and tolerances and other technical requirements for weighing and measuring devices. So in essence, that's the S&T committee. That's what they focus on, is Handbook 44. Handbook 130 is uniform laws and regulations in areas of legal metrology and engine fuel quality. Handbook 133 is checking of net contents of packaged goods. So those two are the L&R committees. So that's why it's important, because once those handbooks have changes made at the national level, if we do not participate, we are stuck with whatever needs to be done. So if it's a change in procedures, we have to follow the procedures. So it's very, very important for us to understand how that process works and the impact that it'll have on California. Next slide. So now we've got to fit the Western and the national process into the process for California, or the California Agricultural Commissioners and Sealers Association. So there's a whole rulemaking process, and it loops back. So I'm going to start with the January interim meeting and kind of walk through where CACASA has input into the process and where we need to do certain things. So out of the interim meeting that happens in January, those items are reviewed and presented at our spring conference. And at that point, we figure out what's going to end up, or potentially end up, on the national conference agenda. And during May is when publication 16 comes out, so that corresponds fairly well to our spring conference, so we can develop positions that we want to take at that spring conference. But it's also the time when we need to be thinking about introducing items to the Western Weights and Measures conference or association, because that's the starting of the rulemaking calendar. So in the spring conference, we're doing two things. We're determining what positions that we want to take, or what testimony we want to make, both as an individual sealer and as an organization, at the annual meeting. And we're also thinking about, well, what new items need to be introduced at the Western. Now, one of the things that Kristen always does to help coordinate the ag commissioners and sealers is to really host a review of publication 16 and what's going to come out, what we can expect, and we talk about, you know, what are our positions, what are our thoughts on each one of the items, and by and large we come to consensus on what our feelings are, and we really take those items with us when we go to the meeting, and that's how we determine what our positions are going to be and what our testimony is going to be. Testimony is very important in this national process. So then the next piece comes, and it's coming up for us now, is the Western Weights and Measures Association meeting in September. So from that point, we review and have a presentation at our winter conference, and that helps us determine the positions that we're going to be taking at the interim meeting. So after the interim meeting, that kind of starts that process all over again. So at the interim meeting, it comes out, presented at the spring conference. Then we determine at our spring conference what we're going to be introducing at the next Western meeting. So one very, very important note, and this is where the facilitation that Kristen brings forward for us to talk about, you know, the publication 16 item and the items that are going to end up on these agendas is our winter conference meets in October, but publication 16 for the interim meeting doesn't come out till around November. So there's a little bit of a disconnect, and that's where we need the help in the coordination. So go ahead and go to the next slide, Josh. Okay, so this is the National Conference of Weights and Measures, the process in a little bit more detail. So anyone can propose a change to any of the handbooks. It can be industry, it can be weights and measures officials, it can be any interested party that would like to see a change. So what happens is you have to complete Form 15 with all the necessary research and documentation. So the more detailed that document is, the easier it is for everybody to understand what the changes are. So it's really important to have it very thoroughly vetted before it gets to go through the process. So the way it works is 2 weeks prior to the fall regional association meetings, that proposal is submitted to the National Conference of Weights and Measures, to Donna Onweiler specifically. And the next piece, it says here, if possible, attend. From my experience, if a proposal is submitted, you really need to attend the regional meetings, because it's the submitter's job to shepherd that through the process. They have to be there to answer any questions of any of the members that have questions that may suggest changes. You need to be willing to make modifications on the fly, so it's really, really important to follow it through the regional associations. So what happens next is, if it gets through the regional process, then it's forwarded to the National Conference of Weights and Measures, where it will be considered during the interim meeting in January through the open hearing process. Now remember, it's the Weights and Measures officials and its industry that get to testify on these items. So at that point, and any point along the line, any of the regions can basically have the item, ask to have the item withdrawn, or suggest it be withdrawn, it be put down as developmental, informational, or voting. So in the ideal scenario, the item's very well thought out, it gets through all of the regional meetings as a voting item, it gets through the interim as a voting item, and it gets on to the agenda as a voting item at the National Conference of Weights and Measures in July. So if the item is adopted by the conference in July, it will be published in the handbook and enforceable the following January 1st. Next slide, Josh. So here's an example of Form 15. There's a lot more detail, a lot more attachments that go onto this form, but this is just a quick example. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So here's the weights and measures region. Everything starts, the rulemaking cycle starts with the Western. It starts around September. It then goes to the Central, it goes to the Northeast, and it goes to the Southern. Some of the area groups or some of the regions have both an interim meeting and an annual meeting, so they get 2 shots at an item. That's the basic regional process that it goes through. Go ahead and go to the next slide, Josh. So now kind of comes to the useful websites. So we have the National Conference of Weights and Measures website, the Western Weights and Measures website, DMS, obviously very important site, then the legislative information site. This is where you can go to see any bill and where the progress is and what the testimony is. So Kristen, did I miss anything?
No, you did a really good job in an overview. I just want to remind everybody that the National Conference on Weights and Measures is holding its next interim meeting, which is coming up in a couple of months, January 2016, in California, in San Diego. This is an opportunity, if you have never seen the national model laws and regulations being developed, you've never watched the testimony at the open hearings, seen some of your sealers, some of whom are great orators, please do try to see if you can make it just even for a day or two. Very well worth your while. Then the other thing, John, is you might just mention that CACASA does have its own advocate or lobbyist. That's Matt Seiberling.
Yeah, we have both. We have a state lobbyist that deals with state law. We also have a federal lobbyist, so we kind of interface on both a state and a national level in what we do. So thanks for that, Kristen. That's great. And Kristen makes a good point that this process, to be able to go to the national and the interim meeting in San Diego, it's a great opportunity. I encourage everybody to go. This process is probably one of the better ones that I've seen because industry has great influence and input into the meeting process, and it's really a very, very cooperative process for the majority of the time, and really it's a way to see how we can all work together, industry and regulators, and come up with really uniform and very, very well thought out good rules and regulations.
Yeah.
And that's all I have, Josh.
All right. Well, thank you both so much. John, this PowerPoint, I think, has an amazing amount of detail in it, so I think it'll really behoove folks to take this PowerPoint back and really study its contents. But on the other hand, I think if they get into a oral exam question asking about this process, and I think, a side benefit is you've really illustrated the deputy and CACASA process very well for any issue, not just weights and measures issues. But I think those who study this PowerPoint and review the information that you presented will be very well prepared to answer any sort of oral exam question on these topics. So I really appreciate that. I think Angela Godwin, who's the sealer in Ventura County, is with us as well. Angela, are you there? She may not be. I'm showing she is, but anyways, I'm not showing any written questions right now. The way I'd like to do question and answer is for folks to type out their questions so that I can see them, and then I'll go ahead and read them to our panelists, and then they can answer them from there. I am not showing any questions right now, but I would like to give folks the opportunity to ask questions, and so I'll go ahead and wait and just see if we do get a few questions in. Otherwise, I know everybody's busy and I don't want to keep people longer than they want to be here. So are there any questions at this time?
So let me jump in and kind of spur maybe some questions if people have them. As I kind of went through the process, that California regulation process was one of the questions. How you do California law was one of the questions. And I also had a question on the national process. So it's very important for you to understand where the beginning is, how it starts, the process, and where it ends and where it becomes law or regulation for California specific laws, for legislation, for regulation, and the national process. So if you have any questions on any of that, then definitely ask them now, because those are very, very legitimate questions that have been asked in the past and probably will be asked in the future.
Yeah, one thing, John, if you wanted to touch on, we are getting a few written questions submitted here, but if you wanted to touch on the funding for weights and measures programs, do you want to touch on that for a moment?
Sure. So weights and measures, there's general fund. That's obviously a component of it. Device registration fees are a component of it. We have work plans with DMS. We have the petroleum program that we work in and have contracts with DMS, and we also have the scrap program that we work with. We have an ordinance for scanners, which we collect fees for that. Some counties have Packer ordinances as well. So those are kind of the areas that we receive funding. By and large, the bulk of that funding comes through device registration. And that device registration sunsets on a periodic basis, so that's something that we're always looking at. So that's one of the pieces on legislation that always comes around. We're always trying to figure out, well, how much does it cost to do those devices, and is it the time to ask for an increase? DMS administrative fees are also within that device fee category, but by and large, that's where our funding comes from.
Yeah, I think something really important for candidates to understand is the local county ordinance process. My experience has been that, if you work in Madera County and you're familiar with Madera County's process as far as the Board of Supervisors and getting an ordinance passed, that's fine. It's okay if you answer your questions as well. I work for Madera County, and in Madera County, we have this following process. The important thing to know is that device registration fees are part of state law, and they allow up to a maximum fee to be charged by each county. However, you can't charge that fee unless your Board of Supervisors has authorized that fee to be charged through a local ordinance. And there's a big political component to that, because you're basically charging your local businesses money in order to collect that device fee to pay for your program. So I know in Placer County, we are fairly close to the maximum fees, while we at the same time also give some allowances for production agricultural type devices. John, what's your situation there in Yolo County? What has your board put in place as far as device fees go?
So we're at some of them we're maximum, and other fees we're about in the middle. And it really, those fees are set up so that they're maximum, but you have to be able to justify the cost. So some of the devices that we inspect, our hourly rate plus the time it takes us to inspect the device doesn't justify the top tier of the fee. So we always take that into consideration. Every county does. So some were at the max and some were not. Some were in the middle.
Okay. Well, I've got some questions in now. So let me go ahead and let's start with the first one. I think this is a question for Kristen. Kristen, the question is, what meeting, can you repeat the information on the San Diego, I think it's the interim national conference meeting in San Diego. Do you have the information on that you could repeat?
Yeah, thank you, Josh. I don't have the dates. You can go to the National Conference website. You should see that up on your screen where it says www.ncwm. Click on meetings, and it will tell you the exact dates. It's going to be probably the middle of January. Actually, I've got it. It's the 10th through the 14th of January, 2016. It's in San Diego. If you can only attend for one day, the most important day of the week would actually be Monday. That's the day that the open hearings start, where you'll see people such as John Young and maybe Josh get up and testify on the floor on particular agenda items that have been discussed at the regional associations, and in our case specifically the Western Weights and Measures Association. So for some of you, it may be a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to actually see how the sausage is made. Thank you.
Thank you, Kristen. The next question, I'm going to scroll back a little bit through our PowerPoint slides here. The next question is, could you explain again how California adopts regulations, the roles of the Business and Professions Code, and the handbooks? So to me, that sounds like the difference between the regulation, the BMP code, and the handbooks and how they all interact. Is that
okay?
So is that?
So if that's the question, it's basically covered by this how a bill becomes a law. So the Business and Professions Code, and that's a great question. That is the law. In order to change anything in the Business and Professions Code or add to it, you have to follow the process. You have to get a sponsor for the bill, and it has to go through the legislative process. Regulation, the way that works is it's the Administrative Procedures Act that has to be followed, and that's the rulemaking process. Though any regulation change for weights and measures has to be done by the state agency. In this case, it's the Division of Measurement Standards. That's the California Code of Regulations piece for weights and measures. Then the national handbooks, that's where it goes through the national process.
So just to reiterate, John, the Business and Professions Code is state law which is adopted by or approved by the legislature and the governor.
Correct.
Regulations are the California Code of Regulations, which are rules that are put in place to flesh out the law and are done by the state agency responsible for enforcing those laws. And then the handbooks are adopted by reference through the Business and Professions Code.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Kristen. Another important distinction, and if you'll stay on that slide, Josh.
Yeah.
You notice that the law, for instance, the top bullet, 12107, that's where we adopt by reference NIST Handbook 44. However, there's a caveat down there, the last sentence that says the Secretary may, by regulation, establish specifications and tolerances for devices not included. So that's where we've gone through and we've adopted things like the electric watt-hour code, and we've put that in. We also can make amendments. If we don't like something that was adopted by the National Conference that's going into Handbook 44, we can, by regulation, amend Handbook 44 and take it out or make it California-specific, whatever we need to do. So this is very important. Although we adopt by reference, meaning we take whatever it is that's put into place and it becomes effective the following January, we can, if necessary, fix something we don't like, but we must go through the rulemaking process to do that. If we don't go through the rulemaking process, we run into the potential of doing something that's called an underground regulation, where we're actually taking some action or setting some policies or rules for which we have no legal basis to do so. And that's a slippery slope and cause for lawsuits and all sorts of horrible things.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good point. So we adopt the handbooks, but not always in their entirety.
Correct.
Okay. Next question, and I think it's a really good one. Where can I find information on current issues or topics being dealt with? So where do we go to find the current topics, hot topics?
I don't know if everybody is privy to the reports that are put out. I know DPR and CDFA have monthly reports that are shared at the area groups at the sealer level. And I don't know how those filter down. John or Josh, maybe you can explain that.
Yeah, Kristen, those are actually put out on the county notification system. So the DPR and commissioner, or CDFA rather, commissioner liaisons put out a monthly report, and the CDFA liaison monthly report is put onto the CDFA county notification system. So everyone who's a part of the County Ag Commissioner Sealer Weights and Measures system should be signed up and receiving those email notifications when new documents are posted. And so so that's definitely a good source. Other sources that come to mind for me would be the S&T and LNR agendas for the spring and fall CACASA conferences. Those typically have a lot of items on them. And then, Kristen, I was going to ask you, you have that, you have the webinar you typically host to discuss the agenda items for the conferences. Are those typically available to inspector level staff?
Anybody can sign up for those. Typically we have a mailing list, an email list that's of the sealers and deputies. However, just because you'll know the fact that before the interim meeting sometime in December, we're hosting a Publication 15 webinar to discuss all the agenda items. That's our opportunity to sync up and understand and get consensus on the California position. And then also in typically late June is when we do the publication 16 webinar. So if you're not already a deputy, then you would want to probably keep those timeframes in mind and ask your deputy or your sealer to share that information. And everyone is welcome to join. We always have plenty of space.
Thank you. John, you want to add anything on the hot topics question?
You know, the hot topics on the national level, you're going to see the published agendas and some keys on items that are of specific interest to industry or controversial. You'll see a lot of letters from industry, so paying attention to what's on the National Conference of Weights and Measures site, especially when it gets time for the interim and the national, and taking a look at what's on there. It's a big document, but if you take a look at the letters that are written, it'll give you an idea of items that are somewhat controversial.
Thank you. I don't see any other questions at this time, and so if anybody has any last minute questions, I'd ask you to submit them right away so we can get them before we end the webinar. I know that John and Kristen and I are all happy. If you have a specific question that came up after, funnel them through me and I can try to answer questions. And like I said, we'll get this PowerPoint into everybody's hands. I'm also, as I mentioned, working on a YouTube channel that we will be sending links out to. We're recording each of these webinars and we'll put them on a YouTube channel so that you can log in later and watch them as you have time. The last thing I want to end with, if there's no other questions, is just that, I know at the Commissioner Sealer level, we've been talking a lot about how difficult it is for people who get pigeonholed into one program to expand into other programs. As an inspector, I was primarily assigned to pesticide use enforcement, so the weights and measures stuff was always a little bit more difficult for me. And so we've been talking a lot at the Commissioner Sealer level about how difficult that is for inspectors to branch out from the ag side over the weights and measures side sometimes. And I would just really encourage everybody to work with your supervisors and look for those opportunities where you can get some hands-on experience in the programs that you're not as familiar with. It's all well and good to learn all this stuff and be able to regurgitate, the difference between the BMP code and the handbooks and the regulations. Talk about the CACASA process, but it's also really nice to have some hands-on experience and really be proactive. I would encourage you to be proactive in going out and getting some of that, whether it's a day here or a day there in the field. I think that really benefits you as well. So I don't see any other questions, so I think we're going to wrap this up, and I just want to again thank everyone for attending, and also thank both Kristen Macy and John Young for just a really good presentation that, I frankly learned some stuff here, so really appreciate it. And I am still working to get the recordings set up and get them into your hands, and we'll send you out notification when they're up and running. So thank you very much, and we'll look for the next one on ag funding at the end of the month. Goodbye.
You guys did a great job.
Thanks, Josh.
Thank you.